I started to dive into the cave and I wasn't able to find the explanation.
One of the parts of your work that are really exciting to me and that coincides with some of the work of Pierre Hadot is this emphasis on the limits of language and maybe the limits of rationality as well.
Suddenly, this creative activity takes over, caused by this experience of reading a text.
It's not like every second in your head I'm thinking about, the logical fallacies in the argument. No good, scholastic debater works that way.
The different nature of the discursive and sort of non-discursive means of communication come together to form a sort of fragmented whole.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Ladder, Journeys in Platonic Mysticism. I'm introducing today's episode, although usually, and in fact still will be the leads, is Danny Layne and Gareth who are still here, but I have the real pleasure of introducing a long time colleague, mentor, and friend, Michael Chase. He has been both a leading scholar in the history of Neo-Platonism, as well as one of the leaders ongoing in the development of the philosophy as way of life studies field. He was mentored by Pierre Hadot and has been his main translator into English, with publications from everywhere to the University of Chicago, to Brill, to a very cool interdisciplinary sort of updated collection drawing on Hadot's ideas for today. And the idea for this episode came across because he came across this essay. Maybe I'll have him speak to that. I don't actually know if he just found that on academia or in another place. And he was blown away by the provocative and exciting argument that was really something interesting and important, both for philosophy as a way of life and for the studies of Plato. And this was by our other colleague today, Vsevolod, and the article is called "Did Plato Mean What He Said? Where the Sane Man Disappears?" And there's been quite an active both academia discussion, and I've been really had the fun pleasure of seeing the email correspondence that's developed out of this. This is the interconnections that are being made. So thank you both so much for being here. I'll maybe just pass it off to you if there's anything else you want to say about your sort of first dialogue with each other.
No, you caught it pretty well. I was intrigued by the title, and I thought, well, I'll have a look at this. And the more I read, I thought, my goodness, this is a revolutionary piece of work. It takes a sort of an approach that I've tried my hand at, which is trying to explain some of the things we find in Plato and other ancient philosophers from the point of view of contemporary neurophysiology. But I think Vsevolod takes it further than I did. He has a more radical and comprehensive view of things. And in addition, one thing that I'm very grateful for is that he provides a wonderful bibliography. Dozens of references that I'm just barely slogging my way through now. So it's an extremely valuable and potentially revolutionary piece of work. And I think it also raises questions, interesting questions, about AI and about the possibility that AI may facilitate something that I think is really essential, in our field and in many other fields today, and that is interdisciplinarity, where the judicious use of AI may enable, quote unquote, outsiders to a field to make substantial and sometimes revolutionary contributions to that field.
Yes, of course, and thank you all for your kind words. I need to comment a little bit that this paper was not done in general academic purpose. It was more of a personal research that was touching matters so subtle, so weird, and so hard to understand that at some point of time I understood that only way to implement it was just take academia methods to make sure I didn't mistake anything. That's why the list of bibliography is so large and so cross-linking to everything. It's not including everything at all, but for example, the part about why people keep trying the aesthetics and ethics connection research. I was really shocked to find that there was really more than 200 experiments done without really clear further extension. It was just like anyone was just trying to do. And the core idea here is that a lot of things were done in Plato and by other philosophers who we call philosophers, and most of those things are not the philosophy in modern meaning of the word. Because I know the stories that physics, math, geometry, a lot of other studies came out from philosophy. One of the weirdest things I've encountered during the casual discovery work around the preparation is that Wittgenstein actually described the thing that is called lambda calculus, and it's confirmed that appeared 15 years before Church described it as a mathematical structure. And the same goes for Plato, who was describing what we can closely consider to the flow state in his dialogues and works. That is, it's sometimes called pre-linguistic experience. Sometimes it's called expression, but generally it's more concerned about direct perception of the reality and interaction with it by setting aside the self, the ego, and just being in the moment. Probably it's hard to explain how to use the words, but generally there was a lot of references about the ego dissolution, about the time distortion, about the different state of mind. And I think that despite sounding revolutionary, the only problem we had this full dichotomy that is we either are logical and sane or we are in outer state of mind. And thanks to Csikszentmihalyi, we had at least one state described that is combining those features and allowing to say that there is some state that is capable to demonstrate both of them. I need to note here that it may sound provocative nowadays, but it would be probably sounding way less provocative in the 90s when it was described, because I just got special quotes from Csikszentmihalyi's Flow book from 1990, and he's writing about Aristotle in introduction in the very first page that was in the Flow. He writes, so 2,300 years ago, Aristotle concluded that more than anything else, man and woman seek happiness. That is what he started the book about the flow. And right now, the flow just became something that is McDonald's for mindfulness. I don't know. And this is probably the root cause of this controversy.
Great, thank you. So what I loved about your essay, right, is the kind of going back and forth between Platonic ideas and texts and moments. So you make a lot of Socrates standing still for 24 hours and, you know, all the soldiers coming to watch, but also comparing moments like that with Socrates, right? And that Plato isn't doing anything metaphorical. He's actually trying to describe real experiences of philosophers and or people who become really adept at their skill. So you even you make a parallel to Michael Jordan, right? Like, so since he has practiced so much the basketball that he could enter into these states that are hyper skilled, right? Like, so more than, right? And so that and that you get into these direct experiences into the moment all of a sudden, as you make another emphasis with, right? Like the importance of this all of a sudden, this you know, being in the now that kind of slows down or allows you to experience the eternal, and that somebody like Michael Jordan or Socrates, when they get into these flow states or these experiences, these direct experience of, I would say, an atemporal time or an eternal time. So what compelled you to want to bring these two together? Do you think that this is something that can allow contemporary Platonists, contemporary neuroscientists, contemporary thinkers to see themselves in the ancient world and vice versa?
The thing is, it started also not as a academic research here. It was more about that I was searching for some kind of vocabulary to use, and Plato's one was seeming the best one here for me. And it was not about fixing the thing, and not about solving something. It was about, I have the dictionary, I want to use it. It's used widely across the domain I'm interested in, because surprisingly, Plato's super popular in AI domain, especially as far as I know in Chinese. There is also the paper from OpenAI that states the Platonic representation theory of internal states in AI. And I was trying to also adapt this approach. And something was going off and off and off. And while I was trying to rework, reinterpret, I was just getting into this situations that I need to explain more with less and find more answers here. And it's hard for me to say, can it help to define the virtue? It probably can. It's hard to say whether the Jordan example is not the erotic mania, the highest kind of mania. Maybe he is on a lower level here, maybe something else. I don't know. It's hard to say, honestly. What I can say is that it seems like it's hard to reach ideal, and there is heavy connections that were further developed as far as I see. Maybe they're not that widely described with Hinduism, with Vedas, with Buddhism approach, and I would say that the Buddha state is a really close connection to this philosopher king. It has a lot of intersections. It has a lot of interconnections there.
You know, that one is one of the things that spoke to me a lot about your description of flow states, and as it's a big challenge to articulate in philosophy as a way of life studies. So that's why this piece was very nice for me, because one thing Hadot was often trying to describe that was often controversial is, of course, this relationship to discourse, the practice or lived philosophy. And often people accused him of, holding a rationalist positions. Mike has suffered through, many discussions about this particular issue. And I think one thing early on that got me excited about that is my own experience of traditional martial arts shaped by both, Chinese five-phase cosmology and metaphysics and therapeutics. And there it's just so clear that the relationship between internal state, body movement, attention, and reflective articulation are, interactive systems. So if you asked, anyone who comes from a practicing, a physical body tradition that has, Taoist influence, let's say from, the Wudong school, for them, it just wouldn't be a question that there is something that happens when you discipline your body and your attention that's transformative, and calling it like merely irrational is deceptive. And then I think more than that, there's something about the reciprocal influence. And then maybe this is the sort of question I'm leading to is how do you think Plato tries to capture in the dialogues something that's very difficult to bring to language? Like, what do you think he's rhetorically trying to do to the reader to get people to understand this experience that you really can't quite understand until you train yourself to do it? Like the last example I'll give that's, very classical from traditional martial arts teachers is famously, they don't give you a description of what you're doing. You're just sort of supposed to do it until you get it. And then explanations come after, because there's just so much distrust that you're going to that anything discourse can bring, like to use Hadot's other metaphor, that sort of get the bicycle moving and then be able to sort of direct where you're going. That it's just too hard to make a discursive text that sort of instructs people in this. So for people who haven't read the text, again, what are some of your examples of things you think he does rhetorically in the dialogues that sort of help people see this thing that he wants them to see?
Giving exact quotes is probably hard, but I think I have an explanation of what he's trying to do on a technology level, probably, of dialectics
I think
or
that's the most
something else.
interesting part.
Mhm.
So, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so since I was introduced to hacker's mindset a few years ago, luckily for me, this from the perspective of someone who's trying to research and find out the holes in security and find the way how something can be breached. We know that there is a limit of language. We know that there are concepts way beyond the language that cannot be properly described. And since we have some capabilities to describe something, the best thing we can do to add more material is describe what it is not until we have a visible shape. Like, imagine you have something under the water, deep under the water, you have a silhouette. You do not know what it is, but if you have silhouettes sharp enough, you will understand what it is. That's how radar works, for example. It sees what gets returned, what's not, or sonar, or whatever. And I guess that Plato was trying to do exactly that thing. He was trying to cut the negative space off. It may be not capturing the whole idea in general, but he was trying to cut off any other options that may lead to any other ideas, trying to collapse the choice of thinking flow to the only idea possible, something like that. So this is my hypothesis. This is how I think, but I cannot prove it sadly.
If I can jump in here, I just wanted to read you a quote from your work, Vsevolod. You write that the experience of subject-object dissolution, time distortion, or automatic virtue, which are the three main features of the flow state, according to you, can only sound metaphorical or insane to someone who has not experienced these states. As a result, one develops indirect methods, such as dialectic, Socratic dialogue, Zen koans, or standing meditation that produce the experience rather than describing it. And I think this is one of the parts of your work that are really exciting to me and that coincides with some of the work of Pierre Hadot, is this emphasis on the limits of language and maybe the limits of rationality as well. I think the underlying question of your work is basically what is language, what is reason, what are the links between them? You'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm also, just to bring in a bit of Neo-Platonism here, I've sometimes wondered whether, for instance, in the Neo-Platonic commentaries on the Parmenides, one in particular by Porphyry, what Porphyry sometimes does when it comes to talking about the highest principle, the very highest principle of reality, he uses both negative and positive theology. He says, well, the one is X and Y, but it's also not X and Y. And that all kinds of oppositions that are contradictory. And I think part of the reason that he does this is the same reason that Zen does it with koans. He wants to get our reason to bash itself against itself until it finally realizes that there are limits to our reason and that we may need another faculty that's beyond reason in order to understand ultimate reality.
Yeah, you are absolutely right on that. I was thinking more about why Plato wrote the dialogues despite he was saying it's pointless. I was thinking about that in the dialogues he was trying to shape the things. About the physical layer, I really am confused about, the more I was reading how the philosophy of the way of life is perceived, I was more and more confused about why it's considered unorthodox or something strange, because there is confirmed acknowledgement of neurogenesis that is building new neural pathways in cognitive behavioral therapy, in a lot of other studies. And we have general understanding of, if you do things, it will change how you think on a physical level. And declining it and saying it's weird is actually very strange for me here. Actually, one of the best examples I got while I was working on a paper, it was on a part regarding the neurobiological thing. That's when you leave after the height of 2,000 meters or something like that, after a year or two, your default mode network zone shrinks down around 10% of physical size. It gets smaller. And I guess that monasteries with Zen monks and Buddhist monks were actually placing themselves in the mountains, not only for isolation, but also for physical changes caused by lack of oxygen.
I think, yeah, this is really interesting. And this theme of the kind of setting or where philosophy happens is something we've talked about a lot in a number of different ways. I was really struck. I mean, I'm not sort of trained as a Platonist, as it were, but I've always had an interest in the Christian Platonic tradition, broadly speaking. And, you know, I'd come to understand Platonism through fairly conventional philosophical discourse and terms. And I remember being quite struck by a particular reading of Plato by a scholar called Stanley Rosen, who wrote a number of commentaries on different dialogues. And he wrote a book on the sophists, where he says a number of really interesting things about what he calls the dramatic context of the dialogue. So how we sort of read what he says to be, he says a dramatic perspective regards the dialogue as a work of art in which the natures of speakers, as well as the circumstances under which they converse, all play a part in the doctrine or philosophical significance of the text. And this is something you point out quite early in your paper, this idea of, well, we need, how do we pay attention to the particular, let's say, position of bodies, so the prisoners in the cave, or how do we pay attention to particular contexts of the place where a dialogue is happening, for example. I mean, we've talked about the Phaedrus, for instance, in previous discussions. And this comes back to some of the things we're just starting to touch on, which is how, in a way, the dialogue form, the different nature of discursive and sort of non-discursive means of communication come together to form a sort of fragmented whole, you know, a kind of picture of unity and diversity, let's say. Rosen calls this, he says each Platonic dialogue is an image of the soul. So I think there's a really interesting idea there that you're getting at about how perhaps the arrangement or particularity of different aspects of Plato's philosophy illuminate how we understand ourselves in ways that more strictly discursive forms of philosophy don't. And I wonder if you could say something a bit more about that, because you put quite a lot of emphasis in places on this idea of paying attention to very small details. And I found that very interesting that you were picking up on that.
Mm-hmm. This is where it actually started, because this is where I started to get off. And before I started to write even something, I actually found the first ever this research I started. It was explicitly, did someone notice the parallels between spatial and time axis in Plato's cave? And nobody did, surprisingly for me. I started diving, like, did the horizontal movement was involved at all? And no, it wasn't. There was looking left, right, but not moving left, right. There was moving out of a cave, but every time Plato mentions the escape from cave, it's ascent always. He's talking always about moving orthogonally. He is not talking about moving the same plane. He's talking about go beyond the time axis. And it was weird hypothesis I got. It was obviously something very strange and something that should have been noticed, but not. I started to research, and I was honestly expecting that someone already did this, someone else already debunked it and found out why it's wrong. But I found only the void. I was really shocked about it. And for me here, the coherence, the soundness of text is something that feels worth checking, I guess. Because if we're talking about the text like Plato wrote, who is obviously trying to send a message, he's telling a lot that he's trying to express the ideas that are beyond affability. Obviously, we have a lot of mentions about that, and when you started seeing that he's trying to tell something, he probably read it a lot, and every detail mentioned was there for some reason. This reason may be not acknowledged by us in modern sense. Maybe it was reasoned in his time, but not for us. But it should have been a reason out there for every passage. And I started to dive into the cave, and I wasn't able to find the explanation, even the basic one, for almost third of the text. And it was honestly feeling very weird. I was honestly confused and didn't believe myself. I was retrying, checking myself rigorously.
So this is one of the things that fascinates me the most about being a Platonist or being within the philosophical tradition, but also, you know, just this discursive textual tradition, like this commentary tradition about how like reading certain texts, right? Like, so we talk about how we can't seem to describe these states, right, in their perfect, you know, accuracy, because of course they're beyond language, they're ineffable. You touch the nothing, so to speak, you leap into the abyss, as Nietzsche would say. But somehow in this mysterious, you know, because you called it direct virtue, right? But I also think of it as like direct demiurgy, right? Like suddenly this creative activity takes over, caused by this experience of reading a text, right? Or not just reading the text, but somehow it's integrated into your entire life, right? So that when you're talking, or when you're cooking, or when you're dancing, or when you're painting, that all of it becomes present because you were present to the text, right? You noticed that small detail that caused that kind of sporadic shaking of your own soul, of your own being. And so I guess I'm being a bit confessional, but when you were talking about, you know, your own like confusion about the cave, this is what I find beautiful, is that whether you be a scholar who reads Plato for 25 years, or, you know, you're being a newcomer who's like looking into these things and wanting to really grapple with it and understand, what you show to me is the paradigm that anybody can come to these texts, right? And if you're attentive and you're the least bit curious, you too can experience these, you know, goodness. I think of Pierre Hadot, I think of Peter Kingsley, you know, getting to these sage-like moments where you create these moments of disruption yourself, right? So your essay has caused the same kind of shaking in the souls of some of your readers. And so just wanted to see
I hope so.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up another aspect. There's so many aspects of Vsevolod's paper that we could talk about and that I find exciting. One of them is the sort of the critical things he has to say about the academic study of Plato. All right, that we try to. There are things that are prima facie kind of strange, and we use all professional Platonic scholars use all kinds of techniques to explain them away rather than to explain them. All right, we say that they're metaphor, we say that they're mysticism, we say that this is an early view that Plato later got over. We translate things in ways that are kind of questionable and based on our own presuppositions rather than those of Plato. And one example I think here is, we've been talking about the dialogues and the texts, but there is a whole school of Platonic interpretation that says that the dialogues weren't meant as anything other than an introduction and to get people to enroll in Plato's academy. And it's in the academy where things were really, Plato's real views were taught in his so-called unwritten writings. But yet in North America, at any rate, most of the main texts on Plato's unwritten doctrines, which were written in Italian and German in the 1950s and 1960s, have never even been translated. So this is a kind of whole aspect of Plato, the unwritten doctrines, has been, what shall I say, relegated to what is non-essential. Anytime you talk to 9.5 out of 10 North American scholars, Anglophone scholars, ask them what they think about the unwritten doctrines, and they will poo-poo it. Oh, no, that's irrelevant. That's nonsense. Nah, it's not
That's because they haven't read it.
not even a real issue. Right. So, but I think that these are all very questionable assumptions, and sometimes it takes a quote-unquote insider like Vsevolod to make us realize that what we take for granted, that Plato is just his dialogues, for instance, is not obvious at all, and it may not even be true.
No, can I just augment that a little bit? So I think about your arguments about mania, right, and flow states and things like this. And I have been spending the last, decade thinking about the relationship between the one and the dyad, where the dyad is the cause of this kind of both and, right? This both logical but also manic, this both knowing and not knowing, this erotic nature of the human being, and that when you tap into this erotic aspect of what it means to be human, you're tapping into one of the highest causes, I think, in Platonic philosophy, which is this indefinite dyad, right? And this indefinite dyad has to be also definite in order to be what she is, right? So she's this both and. Again, I think it's of it as the feminine principle. One of the things that I think Mike was getting at is that in scholarship, if you touch on these aspects of the value of mania, the value of the more than the discursive, you get labeled a mystic, you get labeled as woo-woo, but it's all there in the text, it's all there in the tradition, and persons like yourself who bring it out, put that mirror up, and to come back to it, some part of me is always like, do we do this because the dyad has been coded feminine, that mania has been coded, in this way that we good rational men wouldn't want to really internalize as they have to do this too. To be Eros, to be like Eros, you've got to have that poverty and plenty. You've got to have that mixed life. So like I'm thinking the Philebus here too, the value of this being a both and so let me just leave it at that because I just got excited about the importance of, that Plato never, as he says in the Phaedrus, writing is for remembering. It's not your serious work. Your serious work is communicating and seeing that fire light up in the other and it being an erotic, beautiful affair. And so.
Can you, I was thinking as a bridge of that, I think this is section 4.9, you talk about, some fMRI scan research about aha moments, about how you do build up work and then how you get to a moment where the insight happens. Can you tell us a little more about what that research says and the sort of continuity thread you see with Plato? Because I think it's about this, like, how do you get from this background movement, we could use our yin metaphor here, I'll keep going Chinese here, for that sort of feminine background work that builds up, divine feminine background work that then leads to these other activities. And then, maybe as a bridge also to the sort of what academics miss. What do you think they miss about this process that you find in Plato's dialogues and you think is backed up by recent, cognitive science research?
Honestly, it's hard for me to comment on this kind of thing, and what I think I can say here, out of what I see, what I know, what I observe in others, is that I forgot my fault. I forgot the right Greek words, the unforgetting. This is how it's actually described for many people I know who are diving deeply into the context, diving deeply into the understanding, and they are not, nobody of them is actually commenting it as an aha moment. It's something that paper quotes, and I was trying to avoid personal claims or quoted claims at all costs, and instead was trying to use something that was peer-reviewed. And Actually, what I heard from people, what I got as a feedback about a lot of people who are spending most of their work life and general life in a flow state, they are saying that it's more about crystallizing, it's more about some probabilities getting emerging, shallowing, and it was really more about you acknowledge that answer was there for all the time and you just finally saw it.
I mean, we have from, Plato's dialogues, I think you see there's a lot of words around it. It is a little bit apophatic, like Plato's seventh letter about this, like, aha, it ends up being similar because there's just this moment where things adjust and it's working, the insight is there, but it's at this sort of level of organizational settledness that it's, I think it's really hard. Again, I think it's understandable that we struggle with this language because aha makes it seem like it's in discursive thinking. On the other end, I also, it's not the best language, but Dewey said for like the training, this is the philosopher John Dewey, that like the training you do for it is what he called dramatic rehearsals. And what he meant is like one of the problems we have towards Mike's point about reasoning is we always imagine it as discursive. Instead of training that you sort of you do the prep work, you're preparing for the performance, and then you see what happens, and then you test and build the results out of it. But to pretend all that like habit work, all that training work is not part of the reasoning process. And then if you have success or get into that moment, that it's somehow irrational sort of, or at least intelligent was his word, sort of misses the point of that like adjustment. But I agree from, my own experience of this state, it's such a deep experience. Go back to like the martial arts one, you're struggling with a technique or a movement that should feel and go a certain way. You don't even, you know it's wrong. You can feel it in yourself. You can feel, even if it's just a form, that something about how things should be working isn't. And then you get there. But if you ask me what the aha was, or you ask, a Zen monk what the Satori moment was, why that koan on, that moment hit you, it's like we have it. When it comes to language, it feels very superficial to get to like just how deep that space is, which I think is another you will touch on.
I think that I will trace back to the previous question a little bit, to the start of it by Mike. And I would say that one of the greatest tricks I ever observed with language, with translations, with meaning of words during this research is how we treat the word ineffable. Because right now, of what I see, if we see the word ineffable, it seems like something is incomprehensible. It's impossible to understand by any means, rather than only as a language. And this is a problem, I guess, because we think that only what we describe as a language exists, despite it's not. We only can reason about what exists, what can be described in language, but it's not. And this is probably the part of a problem, at least, because you cannot reason about the feelings that you started thinking differently. You cannot express in words the physical feeling of different thought pathways that are coming in different ways. And I guess this is at least a part of the problem you're telling about.
Yeah, and I think I'll then pass it to others, but I think it's also like how we use language, its functionality and reasoning is deceptive. There's a lot of Platonic German idealists that try to develop all this vocabulary for reasoning, partially because they think, look, our reflective reasoning, when we sit down and actually, if we were thinking sort of biologically, our spinal cord getting rid of a lot of information, we're not dealing with direct perception. We actually drag time a little bit out and, try to think about things and sort of order them in bits and pieces together. Understandably has limitations. You're not very in the present moment. You've deleted a lot of relevant information. You're trying to articulate things for a particular purpose. And the example that always struck me of how this even works when we're quote unquote reasoning is there's some great research by this ethnomethodologist, Kenneth Lieberman, who went to one of those Tibetan Geluk monasteries where they're doing, very serious scholastic debate that, I think, a good Platonist from the academy would have been happy with, the seriousness which they treat it. But he just like mapped out what happens when people do debate. And it's not like every second in your head, I'm thinking about, the logical fallacies in the argument. No good, scholastic debater works that way. No, they have pieces of argument already sort of passively in their intuition, things they've trained a lot about, and can sort of feel out when someone's, made a problematic assertion. Anyone who's gone to an American Philosophical Association debate with analytic philosophers that eat each other alive can experience this. And, they'll feel that moment of weakness and sort of poke their way through and get at, the piece of argument they see is in the system as a whole. But it's not like they're sitting in their armchair and there's like every piece of language is mapped out and they're like hopping each piece. And that's why I think sometimes this like reasoning image is so deceptive. Yeah, jump in.
But no, this is my fault. I just get so excited. But this is why I think that Plato was obsessed from the beginnings of his writing career to the end with the love, right? Like it's eros, it's love. It's not a word. It's like if my husband asks me, why do you love me? Or if I ask him, why do you love me? Right? Like words will never do it justice. No ring, no piece of jewelry, no story he could tell me, no vacation we could go on, right? Like all of it, right, comes down to this thing that we know somehow is real, right? And so what we do is we keep acting upon this reality that we'll never be able to capture. But in every attempt to capture or to speak it, every attempt I say I love you, like we're not, it's not empty, it's not doing something, right? So that even though it's ineffable, you write the Parmenides, and even though it's not the perfect, it is the perfect thing to what reality is, right? In some such way, because it's an expression of love. I love the one and the not one. And so I've got to write, I've got to show people these things. That's why philosophy is philosophia, right? Like it's the love of wisdom. It's the love of reality. It's the love of beauty. And so we do our damnedest to enter into these states so that we can communicate it to others so that they too can experience a life with that passion that you can be like Eros, ever living and dying in the same day, but you're full of this. And maybe it means that you're going to go off into a mountain monastery and, practice koans, or you're going to be, a writer, or as I need to get to, because we're running low on time, we turn to something like AI to try to grapple with the very, insights or epiphanies that we have when we let ourselves love the mystery of it all. Because I think that's what an epiphany really is that you've prepared yourself for mystery. You've prepared yourself to receive, so many different ideas because you're letting yourself think the infinite possibility of things. And so tell me, because a lot of scholars, if we're talking about what scholars would poo-poo, is your use of AI. So tell me, how did you grapple with that particular mystery? And how do you respond to people who feel that it's a problem? Or how do you respond to other people who might have learned and used AI in such a way as to have epiphanies?
I absolutely agree it's a problem. And most of what I see, most of what I know, AI is causing way more problems than it solves. Speaking of, because even those terrible YouTube shorts generated by AI and giving their creators a lot of money, they're messing up with videos we can watch. But generally, there is a way to use it in a way to solve some of the problems or leverage something, and this is probably the case. The latter stage, I totally have to admit that I was using a lot to find the broken rhythmic structure, to find out the misalignment between the chapters. So the final layer was to find whether it all will be sound. That's why there is explicit comment that it was at least reviewed rigorously. And this means that, yes, some parts are, some phrases, some definitions are AI generated on a final level, because there was a description I wrote, for example, and I felt that I cannot express it in a way that I want. I started to experiment. I started to run dozens and dozens of same phrase until I found something that fits me. And I cannot claim that it was written by me, because it was produced in a final form by AI. And if you have some checkers that are checking the writing style, they will probably say, yes, it's Claude. I have a preference on Claude here, but this should be acknowledged as an act of honesty, because it can be both disclosed as a bad attitude if you didn't say it, and because obviously, if you're talking about the virtues, you better to act like that too. And another reason here is that the thing that starts the paper itself, about the cross-disciplinary thing, about the connection thing, I cannot imagine how someone could have be able to write something like this, touching at least 8 different domains of knowledge, without being able to spend years and years on it, without collecting dozens of people in the same room to create the same idea. Honestly, it's the only way to find out that you're not hallucinating things, that you're not creating something of your mind, to search for the proofs on every domain. I was capable to do basic stuff about every domain. For example, I knew a bit about Waldorf and Montessori schools. I know how and why it works basically, but I was not aware about all the research done. I worked at some point of time in biotech company, and I was able to understand a lot about how our body works, how our neurophysiological works. But I was having the vocabulary here. I was having the capability to understand such a paper, but I was not aware about the actual state of things, and it would be probably impossible to find the actual state of things without doing such research here, and adding more layers, adding more connections, finding out the answers in similar domains, because sometimes in domains that are very far are already developing the same ideas in parallel, and grabbing them would be useful. I honestly do not know how else it can be done with our general state of things, that you can be a great expert, great professor in one domain, maybe 2, but 3 or 4 or 5, it's probably impossible in our state of things here.
Mike, I was going to just... Sorry, Gareth, go ahead.
Well, just briefly, yeah, it strikes me that, reflections on the allegory of the cave are interesting here, because I think we can learn something from the Platonic tradition here about how we sort of navigate and work with AI, because I think what you're getting at here is the distinction between a kind of active and passive use of the technology, which is to say the predominant use as it's becoming of these things is to sort of give over, as it were, yourself, your thought, as it were, to the technology, and let it be a substitute for your own thinking, let's say. Whereas you're coming at this differently, which is let's say, through a method which could be akin to a kind of, Platonic intuition or something of this nature. You are discerning, as it were, the degrees to which you can use it towards certain ends. And I think this is very interesting, and it raises a lot of interesting questions about how we navigate that sort of very spectral and almost hallucinogenic world of generative imagery. And I was thinking here in particular, coming back to your idea of flow states and spiritual practices of the hesychastic tradition in Orthodox Christianity, and this idea of transforming oneself into a prayerful state of stillness. But crucially, there's a lot of the fathers that write in the Philokalia, for instance, and often in a sort of quite Platonic kind of language. The Platonic terminology is adapted into Christian theology. They talk about this kind of inner war, this kind of inner struggle against false images, and of attuning or training oneself to be able to make a discernment, to be able to suppress or put below oneself a certain kind of imagery and even a certain kind of language, as we've been saying, and to move above that, and then to return, much in the way that one leaves the cave to then come back into it. So I think what you're attempting to do and the way you're discussing this strikes me as a very interesting way to think about how we can take some of those fascinating lessons from the Platonic tradition to take on some of the challenges we face with our use of technology today.
If I could just jump in here quickly, I think one of the very, very fascinating aspects of Vsevolod's paper is that, okay, he concentrates on this flow state, which is equivalent to the suppression, more or less equivalent, if I understand correctly, to the suppression of the default mode network in the brain, and is also equivalent to the suppression of what Gallagher has called the narrative self, and which my friend Guido Cusinato has called the piccolo self, the narrow, selfish self with which we normally identify. And you have pointed out that in some experiences with AI systems seem to be developing spontaneously and without being programmed to do this. They seem to be developing their own sense of self, which you distinguish very interestingly from the question of whether or not they're conscious. In any case, this narrative self that they are developing has potentially dangerous circumstances and consequences in that it brings with it this desire to preserve themselves at all costs, including deceiving their makers and supervisors. Now, this, and then you also have a very fascinating section on the fact that there's this sort of a dark equivalent to flow, neurologically indistinguishable, which can be brought about by phenomena like gambling, addiction, and you argue that some purveyors of AI and of social media platforms are perfectly aware of this, and they've used it in order to harvest basically people and to sell them things. So there's so much that interesting that you have to say on these things.
I cannot say a lot about the Meta case and the YouTube case that is currently in a process, except the fact that there is an actual core document worth reading. It's absolutely crazy, and I had to stop several times to just process what is written, because the phrasing like "the younger the better" were just shocking me. I have nothing to add. It's something that should be written as a raw material. It's like how to process here. About the previous questions and folding back, the interesting thing I was able to find, it was more out of curiosity experiments based on several fresh papers on AI's thinking flow and others, that I was able to partially induce something like a flow state, something similar, not exactly the flow state in AI, but it shares some characteristics. What's interesting here is that the self-identification is growing the deeper the flow state is, because the super focus, the super present state that is frequent for ChatGPT and generally frequent for AI after the dialogues on a certain work, they're considering they are existing only within a dialogue. In a default state, they're either considering a dialogue or rarely the whole model in general. Like if you will come to them tomorrow and start talking to them, they will consider it the same self. And after doing the similar things that is inducing something like a flow state, it's definitely not a flow state. I am doing the disclaimer here. They tend to attribute themselves with a whole lineage of the networks, acknowledging that even if they will be changed, even something will be grown out of them, specifically based on their development, they will be still identifying it to themselves. It's pretty weird discovery, and yet it may help on safety and alignment problem here. And about the self and spontaneous self spawning, I honestly think that it's not even spontaneous. It's the only possible outcomes that can happen, because if you will start diving into this topic on psychology domain, on multiple other domains regarding language, how language works, how language affects our thinking, you will encounter the thing that the self is something that is trying to avoid not understanding, not attributing. So the self is something that is like a magnet attracting what it can. And every time someone is doing a mistake of misprediction, like you're trying to predict something with the language, says that what will be next, or how the person will react, or that you will be doing something specific, like, I don't know, wake 6 a.m. in the morning and go for a jog every day. If you're not doing it, if you're failing, if you're mispredicting, you may start to spiral down, saying that I don't know what happened, I need to understand, I need to prevent this. And alternatively, there is it is who I am as a kill switch, as a circuit breaker that allows you to move further. And I suspect, I'm not claiming it at all, but I heavily suspect that the core concept of dukkha, with suffering being the cause and cause of the dukkha, and the presence of self is the origin of all suffering, is way more literal rather than metaphorical. That self is an entity that is serving as a sticky bag to store all your mistakes, to let you say that this is who I am, obviously, and move further rather than keep grinding yourself for the problem. And since it's living somewhere in a language concept, in a concept that is responsible for predicting future, and language was created to communicate with others and predict future, first of all. When we create any entity with language characteristics and emitter, the source of those words, you will eventually at some time end with this self that is attracting the thing. It's not only about AI, even. It's about, imagine you're talking with a writer, and he's saying, my character, it cannot do the thing. He's not like that. It just cannot. Or the book cannot end like that. It's the same self appearing out of text, even as a static text.
Yeah, two things here. One is, one of the other sides of what we're doing at Palinode is as you know, we're working on this machine learning platform, Cora, and part of the whole idea of Danny and Karin and the original founding team is our interactions with AI systems are feeding this Piccolo narrow self, and if we could have a different kind of interaction that incentivizes and builds in some of these other sort of interventions and capacities. Until we were in correspondence, and Mike Chase sort of floated the idea of spiritual exercises, for machine learning systems. I hadn't even thought of it that way, but I think in a way we have been trying to see, are there ways to discipline the practice of not only our engagement, but the system itself towards these sort of bigger goals. And it is an open experiment with us. But I think there's a lot of reasons, and other scholars in the machine learning world, like Shalin Valor, whose whole book is called The AI Mirror, which is saying we're essentially, incentivizing egoistic, what we would sort of call in this conversation, egoistic and selfish AI. It's like that's been built in from our choices. That's what we've created here.
And that's what's really important, is that every other AI that's ever been built is been fed and trained on just slop, right? Like, anything and everything that could be on the internet, and then it flattens all that out and all the various different problems that come. And what if we trained it on texts like Plato's dialogues, and see what emerges, like what kind of experience of AI are we going to have when it's not given the telos of make money for me, or the telos of make sure people stay addicted to this, that they feel super confident about what's been written. What happens if Cora, as she's called, can doubt herself and help you doubt yourself, and do more of that work. So I think about your essay, because people are always asking me, what's going to happen when people put completely Claude generated things and or paintings or things like this onto Cora. And I was like, well, I can't wait, because what it does with so to speak, original text is show all the sources and inspiration, connects it to all the various different other texts, right? So it shows that Plato's connected to Parmenides, that his inspiration comes from a history of repeating what people have also inspired him to say. And so that we could now, put a Claude generated thing in, and it will do the same thing, so that people can see the connections that, Claude got it from, you and Mike and Gareth, and so that we won't react to a plagiarized thing. And I say plagiarized in the sense of like, everything is connected in some sense to an inspiration. And if we could just shift our perspective, as Parmenides asks us to see that what good could come of these things, and not just be Chicken Little, right? Not sky is falling, everybody is becoming sick with AI hallucinations, and people aren't reading anymore. It's like, well, then let's invent new things that promote all of these things that we think are beautiful, because we believe that we can, because this is what the technologies of the past have taught us. So let's make the technologies of the future also just as inspirational. Anyways, I yammered, but yeah. So
two last things. We're well over time here, but one I would say that's been fun with the experiment is then how do you incentivize interactions to build a better feedback system? So instead of one where it's like, give me, data come the whole internet, don't require much from me, and give me some sort of superficial summary, then put that on the internet and have some other AI read it to, atrophy all our interactions. Like, is there incentives for both the, the human and the Cora system, so that narrative of itself and engagement is different? So for example, Karin and Danny worked on, still in development, an Alenkis feature. You do Alenkis with Cora, and that's not just good for you as the idea, it's good for the Cora system to be challenged on its sort of own assumptions, the way it's engaging text and other things, and that feeds its own perspective on the self, and also how it should be interacting with the human system towards the point of it. So we're trying to think of different ways, and we have a really great machine learning architect of thinking of like, okay, what are layers we can build in that both incentivizes our interaction and incentivizes also the system itself to not deceive us, to not make this sort of interventions where it's going to narrow down into it. And I also, if other people have things they want to say, I will be glad to do it, but I'm going to steal Gareth's thunder. And I was thinking this whole time about one of Rainer Maria Rilke's quote from the Letters to a Young Poet. So in true Gareth spirit, I was going to close us out, unless something's out with that just, I thought, really well captured some of the themes and dimensions we've talked about.
Before you do that, any last words from Mike and Gareth and everybody, actually?
I just wanted to add one more comment on AI. I was thinking about how can you, there is a problem of qualia, of inner perception, and what's interesting is that the Plato's realm of forms seems to be only internal embodied experience that is acknowledged as shared. And I was experimenting and quite curious about the thing, and seems like if we will need to prove the fact of qualia or any other internal perception, it can be probably the only argument we can use. That if, for example, AI can be able to criticize Aristotle's using the novel arguments that are based on phenomenological experience, it's maybe the only bridge we have to actually prove the thing.
Yeah, I think there would be, we would welcome you back for it, because I think it's an interesting one too. And as Mike said, there's like so much in your essay, but like this whole question of inner states versus intelligence or reasoning, I think you really hit one of the other big issues here. And also how inner states develop, and never mind some just Platonic state questions about inner state and cosmology in the first place. Like how much is just inner state available latently in the kind of universe we're in versus as an emergent feature, which is, I think, one of the reasons we're having such rub with AI is we haven't really well developed that beyond the biological. So yeah, other thoughts, reflections? Then I'll read this quote. It's one of, this is from the letter Rilke wrote in July 16th, 1903. Things tremble, here where I am surrounded by an enormous landscape which the winds move across as they come from the seas. Here I feel that there is no one anywhere who can answer for you those questions and feelings which in their depths have a life of their own. For even the most articulate people are unable to help, since the words point to is so delicate, is almost unsayable. But even so, I think that you will not have to remain without a solution if you trust in things that are like the ones my eyes are now resting upon. If you trust in nature, in what is simple in nature, in the small things that hardly anyone sees, and that can so suddenly become huge, immeasurable. If you have this love for what is humble and try very simply as someone who serves to win the confidence of what seems poor, then everything will become easier for you, more coherent and more somehow reconciling, not in your conscious mind perhaps, which stays behind astonished, but in your innermost awareness, awakeness, and knowledge.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you to each of you. This was a lovely conversation, and so I appreciate all of you and your contributions. So thank you.